The morning sun wouldn't bless Havenbrook today, casting shadows long and cold across the weathered barns and dying fields. Sometimes the most powerful men in the world arrive not to praise, but to silence those who've forgotten their place. And in this forgotten corner of America, both the powerful and the forgotten were about to collide in ways that would shake a nation. Before we delve into this story, share where you're watching from. And if this resonates with you, don't forget to subscribe, because tomorrow brings another journey that might just change your life. The auction notices had been plastered across town for 3 weeks, each one bearing Walter Henshaw's name like a death warrant. In bold black letters, the flyers announced the dissolution of one of Havenbrook's oldest farms. 180 acres of prime Missouri soil, 10 generations of history, and enough memories to fill a lifetime. The courthouse steps, the general store, the barbershop window, everywhere folks looked, that name stared back like an accusation. Walter had first seen the notice at the feed store while buying supplements for his aging cattle. His weathered hands, permanently stained from decades of working the land, had trembled as he'd torn it down, stuffing it deep into his pocket. But like invasive weeds, the notices kept multiplying. The bank, it seemed, had grown tired of waiting. Foreclosure, they called it, a cold word for something that felt like murder. 6 months of missed payments after a drought that had turned his corn to dust and his soybeans to stunted shadows of themselves. The bank president, Marcus Blackwell, had called it unfortunate but necessary. Walter had called it betrayal. The farm had been with the Henshaws since before the Civil War, and Marcus's own grandfather had built his bank on loans to farmers like Walter. The morning of the auction dawned grey and overcast, as if the sky itself mourned what was about to transpire. Walter stood on his front porch, staring at the empty fields that would soon belong to someone else. His worn Marine Corps cap sat at a slight angle on his head, hiding the few strands of silver hair that remained. At 83, he'd earned every line on his face, every ache in his joints. 2 Purple Hearts, a Silver Star, and a Distinguished Service Cross sat in a dusty frame above his fireplace, tokens of a war that seemed like yesterday and a lifetime ago, all at once. "Dad, you don't have to go," his daughter Sarah had said at the night before, her voice tight with emotion. "Let me handle it. You've been through enough." But Walter had shaken his head. "This farm is my responsibility, has been since your grandfather passed it to me. If it's going to end, I'll see it through." Sarah had inherited his stubborn streak, but even she knew when arguing was futile. By 9 o'clock, cars and trucks had begun gathering in his yard, kicking up dust that settled like grief on everything it touched. Neighbors arrived with downcast eyes and sympathetic pats on the shoulder. Some had come to bid, to grab pieces of Walter's legacy while they could. Others came merely to bear witness to the death of an era. The auctioneer, Chad Beaumont, rolled in at precisely 9:45 in a gleaming black Escalade, its chrome wheels flashing like a cruel joke. Everything about Beaumont screamed city, from his perfectly pressed suit to his manicured nails to the Rolex that glinted on his wrist. He'd made a name for himself in the cutthroat world of estate auctions, specializing in what he called rural opportunities. "Morning, Hank," he called out to one of Walter's closest neighbors, deliberately mangling the man's name. "Beautiful day for an auction, wouldn't you say? Though I suppose it's all relative when you're on the losing end." His laugh carried across the yard like fingernails on a chalkboard. Walter watched from his steps as Beaumont set up his portable podium, adjusting his microphone with theatrical precision. The man moved with the confidence of someone who'd never missed a meal or held a funeral for their dreams. His assistant, a young woman with too much makeup and eyes that wouldn't meet anyone's gaze, sorted through papers with mechanical efficiency. At 10 sharp, Beaumont tapped his microphone. "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to what promises to be a premier liquidation event. Today, we're offering one of Missouri's finest agricultural properties, 180 acres of prime farmland, complete with all buildings and equipment." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Everyone knew this wasn't a celebration, but a tragedy wrapped in legal jargon. "Now, I know some of you soft-hearted locals might feel a bit sentimental about this place," Beaumont continued, his voice dripping with condescension. "But let's be real, farming isn't about feelings. It's about profit, efficiency, and knowing when to cut your losses. And frankly, some folks just aren't cut out for this business anymore." A murmur rippled through the gathered farmers. Walter's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. "Take our cellar here," Beaumont gestured toward Walter with casual cruelty. "A fine example of what happens when tradition gets in the way of progress. 83 years old and still trying to work land. That should have been sold off decades ago. But hey, that's what we get for letting nostalgia trump common sense, right?" Sarah stepped forward, her face flushed with anger. "That's enough. My father served this country." "Oh, here we go with the war stories," Beaumont cut her off with a wave of his hand. "Look, sweetheart, I respect the military and all, but this is business. Your old man should have retired to Florida like every other geezer with a pension instead of clinging to a dying way of life." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Walter felt every eye turn to him, waiting for his reaction. He'd faced down enemy fire in Korea, stared death in the face more times than he could count, but something about this moment cut deeper than any bullet ever had. "Shall we begin?" Beaumont called out, oblivious or indifferent to the tension he'd created. "Do I hear an opening bid of $300,000 for this fine establishment? That's practically stealing, folks. Though I suppose some of you are used to getting handouts from the government." The insult struck its target. Several veterans in the crowd, men Walter had served with, or whose sons and daughters had followed in their footsteps, bristled visibly. Jake Morrison, who'd lost his left arm in Desert Storm, took a step forward, but was held back by his wife. "Nobody? Really?" Beaumont's voice took on a theatrical dismay. "Come on, people, we're talking about prime real estate here, perfect for development. Think strip malls, maybe a nice little subdivision. We could call it Henshaw Heights. Give the old goat something to be remembered by." The laughter that erupted from Beaumont's throat was the only sound in the yard. Even his assistant had the grace to look uncomfortable. "You know what your problem is?" Beaumont addressed the crowd, emboldened by their silence. "You're all living in the past, clinging to some romantic notion of family farms and American values. Meanwhile, the world's passing you by. Look at this place." He swept his arm across the property. "It's practically begging to be put out of its misery." Sarah had tears in her eyes now, but Walter placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "It's all right, sweetheart," he murmured. "Let him talk." "Oh, come on," Beaumont pressed. "Surely someone wants a piece of agricultural history. Or are you all as broke as our friend Walter here? I heard the VA benefits don't stretch as far as they used to." That did it. Jake Morrison shook off his wife's restraining hand and stepped forward, his voice carrying across the yard with military precision. "You want to talk about service? about benefits. Let me tell you something about that man you're insulting." But before Jake could finish, a sound cut through the morning air. At first, it was just a distant thrum, barely noticeable above the murmur of the crowd. Then it grew louder, more insistent, until everyone's eyes turned skyward. A helicopter appeared over the horizon, low and fast, its rotors cutting through the morning haze like a blade. Not just any helicopter. The distinctive white and blue paint scheme, the presidential seal visible even from a distance. Marine One was approaching Havenbrook, Missouri. Beaumont's microphone dropped from his suddenly nerveless fingers, the feedback screech cutting through the stunned silence. His perfectly tailored suit suddenly looked rumpled, his confident posture deflating like a balloon with a slow leak. The helicopter circled once, twice, before beginning its descent toward Walter's back pasture, sending dust and papers flying in all directions. Secret Service agents materialized from what seemed like thin air, clearing a landing zone with swift efficiency. Cars screeched to a halt on the road outside the farm, more agents pouring out to secure the perimeter. "What the hell?" Beaumont whispered, his city-slick veneer cracking like old paint. His assistant had already retreated to the safety of their Escalade, phone pressed to her ear as she frantically tried to make sense of what was happening. Walter stood perfectly still, his Marine training kicking in even after all these years. He recognized the choreography of high-level security, the precise movements of men who dealt in matters of national importance. But why here? Why now? As Marine One touched down, its engines winding down to a low whine, every person in attendance held their breath. This wasn't supposed to happen. Presidents didn't land in dying farm fields. They didn't interrupt foreclosure auctions. They certainly didn't involve themselves in the struggles of forgotten farmers in forgotten towns. The helicopter door opened, and there he was, the President of the United States, stepping down onto Missouri soil with the casual confidence of a man who could reshape destiny with a word. His chief of staff followed close behind, along with other advisers whose faces were familiar from countless news broadcasts. Sarah grabbed her father's arm, her fingers digging into his sleeve. "Dad, what did you do?" she whispered. But Walter could only shake his head in bewilderment. Beaumont had gone pale. All traces of his earlier arrogance vanished like morning mist. He fumbled for his microphone, nearly dropping it again in his haste. "Ladies and gentlemen," he stammered, "I think we should postpone—" "No!" The president's voice cut across the yard, amplified by his own detail of communications specialists. "I think we should finish exactly what Mr. Beaumont started. Please continue your auction. I'm eager to hear more about agricultural history and American values." The crowd parted like the Red Sea as the President of the United States walked toward the auction podium, Secret Service agents flanking him like guardian angels. News helicopters appeared on the horizon, cameras no doubt capturing every moment of what would soon become a national sensation. Beaumont stood frozen, his earlier confidence shattered like glass. The microphone in his hand trembled slightly, betraying the fear that had replaced his arrogance. "Mr. President," he began, "I didn't know, that is, we weren't expecting—" "Weren't expecting what?" the president asked, his voice carrying a hint of steel beneath its polished surface. "Weren't expecting consequences? Weren't expecting someone to pay attention when you mock a man who gave more for this country than you'll ever understand?" The silence was absolute. Not even the wind dared to interrupt this moment. Walter, drawing on decades of military discipline, straightened his posture and removed his cap, holding it respectfully as the commander-in-chief approached. The president stopped directly in front of him, and for a long moment the two men simply looked at each other, one the leader of the free world, the other a humble farmer who'd answered his country's call. "Marine," the president said softly, "it's an honor to meet you." "Mr. President," Walter replied, his voice steady despite the surreal nature of the moment, "the honor is mine." The president turned to face the crowd, his expression stern. "I was reading intelligence reports this morning when my chief of staff showed me something disturbing. A brief article about a farm auction in Missouri. Nothing newsworthy, really, except for the man whose farm was being sold. Walter Henshaw. 2 Purple Hearts, a Silver Star, and a Distinguished Service Cross. The most heavily decorated Marine in his battalion. A man who fought on the frozen slopes of Korea when he was barely older than most of our kids today." Beaumont had backed away from the podium, trying to become invisible, but the president's gaze found him like a spotlight. "And then I saw who was conducting the auction," the president continued, his voice rising slightly. "Someone who thought it appropriate to mock a national hero, to insult him, his service, his family, and everything he stands for. Someone who forgot that the freedom to conduct business in this country was bought with the blood of men like Walter Henshaw." The cameras were rolling now, broadcast vans from every major network pulling up outside the farm's boundaries. What had started as a local tragedy was becoming a national moment. "So I cancelled my morning meetings," the president said, "and I came here to tell Mr. Beaumont something important. This auction is over, not just paused, finished, done. And Mr. Henshaw, if you're willing, we need to have a conversation about what this country owes men like you." Sarah had silent tears streaming down her face now, clinging to her father's arm as the reality of the moment sank in. The neighbors, Walter's community, erupted in applause and cheers that echoed across the fields. Beaumont finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Mr. President, I was just doing my job. The bank has legal rights." "The bank," the president interrupted, "has 30 days to reconsider its position, and if it chooses not to, well, there are federal programs for veterans facing foreclosure that I'd be happy to expedite, personally if necessary." Marcus Blackwell, the bank president who had been watching from the edge of the crowd, stepped forward with visible reluctance. "Mr. President, I assure you, we'll work something out." "You have 30 days, the president repeated firmly. "And I suggest you start by finding someone else to handle foreclosures for you. Mr. Beaumont's services are no longer required. In fact, I believe his reputation in the auction business just took rather a significant hit." Beaumont stumbled backward, his career crumbling around him like dust. "I didn't know," he muttered. "I didn't know who he was." "That's the problem," the president said quietly. "You didn't know. You didn't care to know. You saw an old man, a failing farm, and you thought you could capitalize on someone else's misfortune with impunity. You forgot that every one of these farms has a story. Every one of these farmers has sacrificed for this nation in ways you'll never comprehend." The president turned back to Walter, his expression softening. "Sergeant Henshaw, I'd like to invite you to join me for a brief discussion. We have much to talk about: agricultural policy, veteran services, and the preservation of our rural heritage. Your experience and perspective are exactly what we need." Walter squared his shoulders. Every inch the Marine he'd been 6 decades ago. "It would be my privilege, Mr. President." as the most powerful man in the world, led a humble farmer toward Marine One, with cameras capturing every moment and the world watching in astonishment. Chad Beaumont stood alone amid the wreckage of his arrogance. His Escalade suddenly seemed small and cheap, his reputation lying in tatters at his feet. Sarah watched her father walk toward the helicopter, pride radiating from every step. The farm was saved, their honor restored, and their story would be told for generations to come. The auction stand stood abandoned, a silent monument to the price of underestimating those who have given everything for their country. In the fields beyond, the wind picked up, rustling through the corn that would now be allowed to grow. The Henshaw farm would survive another season, another year, another generation, and somewhere in the distance, America watched and learned that heroes come in many forms, some wearing suits and ties, others wearing weathered caps and bearing old wounds. As Marine One's engines began to spool up, preparing to carry its unusual passenger to destinations unknown, the people of Havenbrook realized they were witnessing something extraordinary. In a world that too often forgot its heroes, one had been remembered today, one had been honored, one had been saved. The helicopter lifted off, dust swirling in tiny tornadoes, carrying away the morning's shame and leaving behind a town that would never forget the day their neighbor received not just a presidential visit, but a national acknowledgement of all that he had given and all that he was. And Chad Beaumont? He slipped away quietly, his Escalade kicking up dust as he fled back to the city that had shaped him, forever haunted by the moment he learned that even in rural America, even in forgotten corners of the heartland, justice sometimes arrives on the wings of a presidential helicopter, bringing with it the power to humble the mighty and honor the meek. The interior of Marine One was surprisingly ordinary in its functionality, though every surface bore the unmistakable mark of presidential authority. Walter Henshaw sat across from the president in a leather captain's chair that had cradled world leaders and dignitaries, feeling simultaneously out of place and exactly where he needed to be. The helicopter's rotors hummed with a steady rhythm that reminded him of Huey transports from his younger days, though this ride was considerably more luxurious. "Coffee," the president offered, gesturing to his steward, who stood ready with a silver service. "I've been told it's the best in the world, though I suspect you've tasted better from a field percolator under less hospitable conditions." Walter accepted with a nod, noting how the steward's hands didn't tremble despite the helicopter's movement. The coffee was indeed excellent, but the president was right. Nothing could match the taste of morning brew shared with fellow Marines in positions thousands of miles from home. Below them, the Missouri landscape unfolded like a patchwork quilt, fields and forests giving way to suburbs, and eventually the outskirts of Kansas City. The chief of staff sat nearby, typing furiously on her laptop while fielding calls that never seemed to stop. Every few minutes, she'd glance at Walter with barely concealed curiosity, clearly wondering what had prompted this unprecedented detour in the presidential schedule. "I apologize for the disruption to your morning," Walter began, finding his voice. "I'm certain you have more pressing matters than an old farmer's troubles." The president waved away the apology. "Sometimes the most pressing matters are the ones right in front of you. Besides, I've wanted to visit Middle America more often, get away from the Washington bubble. Just didn't expect it to happen quite like this." He leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "You know, my father served in Vietnam. Air Force. He never talked much about it, but he had that same bearing you do. The quiet dignity that comes From seeing too much and saying too little, Walter nodded, understanding the unspoken bond. Different wars, same questions, same things we can't explain to those who weren't there. Exactly. The president pulled out his phone, scrolling through messages. Speaking of explaining, we've got about 30 minutes before we land at Whiteman Air Force Base. My team's assembled a briefing on agricultural policy and veteran support programs. I thought you might have some thoughts on what's working and what isn't. What followed was unlike any meeting Walter had ever imagined having. The president listened intently as Walter described the challenges facing family farms. Rising equipment costs, unpredictable weather patterns, international trade issues affecting crop prices. Sarah's voice echoed in his mind as he explained how young people were leaving rural communities, how the tradition of passing farms from generation to generation was dying like his own nearly had. And the VA, the president asked, making notes on a legal pad. How well is it serving our aging veterans? Walter considered his words carefully. The VA does its best with limited resources, but there's a disconnect between policymakers in Washington and folks on the ground. My local VA clinic is 2 hours away. For men like me, driving isn't getting easier. The chief of staff spoke up. We've been working on telehealth initiatives, virtual appointments. Virtual appointments can't help with physical therapy, Walter interjected gently. Can't diagnose complicated pain that comes from old wounds. Can't provide the human connection that matters when you're alone in a farmhouse, wondering if anyone remembers your service. A moment of silence followed, broken only by the helicopter's steady drone. The president set down his pen and looked directly at Walter. Would you be willing to serve your country again, in a different capacity? Walter felt his pulse quicken. How so, Mr. President? I need advisors who understand rural America, who can bridge the gap between Washington and Main Street, between policy and practice. Your voice matters, Sergeant Henshaw. Your perspective could help shape programs that actually serve our veterans and our farmers. Before Walter could respond, his phone buzzed, a text from Sarah. Dad, you won't believe what's happening. Local news is here, national networks too. Beaumont left town. Bank president called, wants to renegotiate. Call when you can. The president noticed his expression. Good news? The kind that comes from shame going viral, Walter replied, showing him the text. Sometimes justice arrives through public humiliation, and sometimes it rides in on a helicopter, the president added with a wry smile, though I admit this morning wasn't planned. When my team showed me that article about the auction, about Beaumont's comments, well, some things demand an immediate response. They touched down at Whiteman Air Force Base 20 minutes later, greeted by a full military honor guard that made Walter's chest tighten with remembered pride. The B-2 Spirit bombers sitting on the runway were a far cry from the prop planes. He'd known, but the respect in the airmen's eyes as they saluted was unchanged across generations. General Morrison, the president, introduced the base commander, meet Sergeant Walter Henshaw, Marine Corps, Korea, Silver Star, DSC, multiple Purple Hearts, the man we're honoring today. The general's crisp salute spoke volumes about the military's unbroken chain of respect for those who've served. An honor, Sergeant. Welcome to Whiteman. What followed was a whirlwind tour of facilities, briefings, and policy discussions. But the real moment came in the base commander's office when the secure video conference connected to the Oval Office. Situation room. Gentlemen and ladies, the president announced to his assembled advisors on screen. I'd like you to meet Walter Henshaw. He's going to help us understand why our current agricultural and veteran policies aren't reaching the people who need them most. Walter recognized several faces from news broadcasts: the Secretary of Agriculture, the VA administrator, key congressional leaders, all waiting to hear from a man who, until this morning, had been invisible to their radar. Mr. Henshaw, the Secretary of Agriculture, began, "What would you say is the biggest challenge facing family farms today?" Walter thought of his fields, his neighbors, the auction that never finished. The biggest challenge isn't the weather or the markets or even the technology. It's the loss of hope. When you see nothing but foreclosure signs and empty barns, when your children move to cities and your banks treat you like a liability instead of an asset, hope becomes harder to harvest than corn. The video conference room fell silent. These were people accustomed to charts and statistics, not the raw humanity of struggle. "We've lost sight of something important," Walter continued, gaining confidence. "Farms aren't just businesses. They're communities, traditions, ways of life that have sustained this nation since before it was a nation. When we let them die for the sake of efficiency or profit margins, we lose more than agriculture. We lose our soul." Over the next hour, Walter described solutions born from practical experience: cooperative equipment sharing, mentorship programs pairing aging farmers with young veterans, mobile VA services for rural areas, community banks focused on agricultural investment rather than just balance sheets. "And Beaumont?" the president asked finally. "What happens to him?" Walter considered the question carefully. "He's already paid his price in public shame. But perhaps he could be useful, not as an auctioneer, but as someone who now understands the human cost of foreclosure. Let him work with the VA, with farm services, seeing firsthand what he casually destroyed this morning." The president nodded approvingly. "Restorative justice rather than purely punitive. I like it." As the meeting concluded, the Chief of Staff approached Walter with papers and a pen. "Mr. Henshaw, if you're willing, we'd like to appoint you as a special advisor on rural veteran affairs. No formal title, but direct access to the president and key departments. Will you serve?" Walter thought of his farm, his neighbors, all the forgotten veterans struggling in silence across America. "I'll serve," he said quietly, signing where indicated. The return trip to Havenbrook was different, not just because Walter was no longer a private citizen, but because the landscape below had changed somehow. The same fields he'd flown over, that morning now represented something larger, a responsibility he'd never sought but couldn't refuse. His phone kept buzzing with messages. Local newspapers wanting interviews, network news requesting comments, but most importantly, texts from neighbors. "Auction cancelled. Bank backed down. We're saved." As Marine One approached his farm for landing, Walter could see the crowd had grown substantially. News vans lined the road, satellite dishes pointing skyward like mechanical flowers, but among them were familiar faces. Jake Morrison, Marcus Blackwell, looking properly chastened, women from the Historical Society, children from the regional school. Sarah stood at the front, tears of pride streaming down her face as her father descended from the helicopter for the second time that day. The president accompanied him, shaking hands and posing for photos with the crowd. But the real moment came when he handed Walter something small and metallic. "Your great-grandfather farmed this land after the Civil War." the president said loud enough for everyone to hear. "Your grandfather during the Depression, your father during World War II, and you've kept it alive through everything life could throw at you. This belongs with the farm, not in some Washington archive." In Walter's palm lay a presidential unit citation earned by his battalion in Korea during the Battle of the Chosin Reservoir. Somehow, the president's team had located it and brought it home. The crowd applauded as Walter pinned the citation to his chest beside his service medals. Then, surprisingly, the president removed his own suit jacket and rolled up his sleeves. "Mr. Henshaw mentioned you have fences that need mending," he announced. "Anyone care to join me?" What followed was perhaps the most surreal afternoon in Havenbrook's history. The President of the United States spent 2 hours helping repair fence lines alongside local farmers, Secret Service agents standing guard while their principal drove fence posts and stretched wire. News cameras captured every moment, but for the people of Havenbrook, this was less about publicity than validation. Their lives mattered, their struggles were recognized, their sacrifices were remembered. Later, as the sun began to set, and when prepared to depart, Walter found himself alone with the president for a final moment. "Thank you," Walter said simply, "not just for saving my farm, but for everything." The president clasped his shoulder. "Thank you for reminding us why we serve in the first place. Every bureaucrat, every politician who watched this unfold today learned something important about the real America they represent." As the helicopter lifted off into the golden hour light, Walter stood with his daughter, watching until it became a speck on the horizon. The crowd gradually dispersed, life slowly returning to normal, though nothing would ever be quite the same again. That evening, as Walter sat on his porch with Sarah, watching the sun set over fields that were still his phone rang one last time. Marcus Blackwell, the bank president. "Walter, I want to apologize. Not just for the foreclosure, but for forgetting who you are, what you've done for this country. The loan is forgiven. Consider it a long overdue show of gratitude." After hanging up, Walter sat in silence for a long moment. Then he turned to Sarah with a slight smile. "You know what the real miracle was today, besides the president showing up?" "Besides that," Walter gestured toward the fields, "the miracle was remembering that we're not alone, that someone always remembers, even when it seems like the whole world's forgotten, whether it comes in a presidential helicopter or just a neighbor bringing dinner when times are tough. Someone always remembers." As night fell over Havenbrook, lights flickered on in farmhouses across the valley. In each one, families gathered to watch news footage of their neighbor walking with the president, of ordinary decency prevailing over casual cruelty, of justice arriving in the most unexpected way. And somewhere in Kansas City, Chad Beaumont sat in a darkened hotel room, scrolling through social media and watching his reputation die one share at a time. Tomorrow he would return to Chicago and attempt to rebuild his career, forever changed by the lesson that power comes in many forms, and sometimes the most powerful people are those who've never sought power at all. In the morning, Walter would join his first video conference as a presidential advisor, bringing voices from forgotten America to halls of power, where those voices had been silent too long. But tonight, he was simply a farmer, sitting on his porch with his daughter, watching stars emerge over land that had belonged to his family for generations, and would continue to do so for generations more. Sometimes justice arrives on wings of steel. Sometimes it comes wrapped in the quiet dignity of those who've given everything and asked for nothing. And sometimes, just sometimes, the powerful remember to honor those they've forgotten, and in that remembering restore not just one man's faith, but a nation's. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of growing corn and distant rain. Walter pulled his Marine Corps cap lower on his head and smiled. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to serve, but tonight, under Missouri stars, all was right with the world. And somewhere above, perhaps, the ghosts of generations. Of Henshaw, farmers looked down and nodded their approval. Dawn broke across the Missouri horizon with unusual clarity, as if the events of yesterday had cleansed the very air itself. Walter Henshaw stood on his porch, coffee steaming in his hands, surveying fields that had nearly belonged to someone else. The weight of yesterday's events settled on him like morning dew, not heavy enough to burden, but present enough to remind him of what had transpired. Sarah emerged from the kitchen, phone already pressed to her ear. "The networks want interviews," she said, covering the receiver. "Morning shows, cable news, podcasts. Everyone wants to hear your story." Walter shook his head gently. "Not ready for that. Still trying to believe it happened myself." His first video conference as a presidential advisor was scheduled for 9 o'clock. The government had expedited security clearances, set up encrypted communications, and designated a corner of his office, once used to store seed catalogues and almanacs, as an official workspace. The contrast between his weathered desk and the sleek federal equipment was almost comical. At precisely 8:55, Jake Morrison appeared at the gate, driving his battered pickup truck. His missing arm from Desert Storm moved with phantom precision to shift gears, a routine so practiced it had become second nature. "Thought you might need moral support," Jake called out, climbing the porch steps. "First day as a government advisor and all." Walter nodded gratefully. "Appreciate it. Truth is, I'm not sure I know what I'm doing. Does anyone?" Jake leaned against the railing. "You spoke truth yesterday, that's all they asked for." The video screen flickered to life at exactly 9, revealing a conference room filled with faces Walter recognized from the previous day. The president appeared last, giving a slight nod of acknowledgement as he took his seat. "Gentlemen and ladies," the president began, "Mr. Henshaw has agreed to help us understand rural America better. I've asked him to spend the next hour telling us exactly what's wrong with our current approach to agricultural policy and veteran services. No political correctness, no bureaucratic language, just honest assessment." Walter squared his shoulders, remembering commanding officers far more intimidating than cabinet secretaries. With respect, the problem isn't your policies. It's that you don't know who they're affecting. You see numbers, statistics, crops per acre, benefit claims processed. You don't see John Peterson losing his dairy farm because milk prices crashed. You don't see Maria Sanchez crying because the VA cut her transportation benefits and she can't get to chemo. You don't see the faces behind the foreclosure notices. He spoke for 40 minutes straight, drawing on decades of experience in rural communities. He described how farm equipment had become so technologically advanced that repairs required specialists from hours away. How young veterans returning to rural areas found jobs scarce and services non-existent. How the suicide rate among farmers exceeded that of any other profession, including law enforcement and military. "The crisis isn't just agricultural or medical," Walter concluded. "It's existential. When rural America dies, something fundamental about this nation dies with it. The self-reliance, the community spirit, the connection to land that shaped our national character, all of it disappears beneath strip malls and housing developments. The Secretary of Agriculture cleared his throat. "Mr. Henshaw, you painted a rather grim picture. What would you suggest?" "Start by listening," Walter replied. "Not to lobbyists or policy experts, but to actual farmers, actual veterans. Send your staffers to county fairs and VFW halls instead of K Street restaurants. And when you craft policies, ask yourself, would this help John and Maria, or just look good in a press release?" After the conference ended, Walter found himself drained but oddly energized. The ability to speak directly to power, to bypass layers of bureaucracy and political calculation, was something he'd never experienced before. His phone rang. Marcus Blackwell, the bank president who had first authorized the foreclosure. "Walter, I wanted to follow up personally. The board met last night. We're establishing a new division focused on agricultural lending with flexible terms for family farms. We're also donating a significant portion of our profits to local veterans' services. Consider it penance, if you will." "Penance is good," Walter replied, "but commitment is better. Make it stick." Over the next days, Walter's modest farm became an unlikely hub of activity. Policymakers visited, cameras documented, and average citizens wrote letters thanking him for speaking truths they'd felt but couldn't voice. The attention was overwhelming, but Walter discovered something remarkable. His voice carried weight not because of his sudden fame, but because of its inherent truth. Chad Beaumont, meanwhile, had indeed returned to Chicago, but his life bore little resemblance to what he'd left. His agency had terminated his contract within hours of the viral video going nationwide. Calls from former clients went unreturned. Invitations to exclusive events dried up like Missouri rivers in August drought. He sat in his luxury apartment overlooking Lake Michigan, watching cable news replay the footage of his humiliation. The smug confidence, the casual cruelty, the moment Marine One appeared on the horizon. It all played in an endless loop, each viewing stripping away another layer of denial. His phone rang. An unknown Missouri number. "Beaumont." The voice was unfamiliar but firm. "This is Daniel Rodriguez from the VA regional office. Walter Henshaw suggested we contact you." Beaumont's heart sank. "Look, I've already apologized. This isn't about apologies. It's about making things right. We're establishing a program for veterans facing foreclosure, helping them maintain their property through difficult times. Mr. Henshaw suggested someone with auction experience might assist in asset valuation, but from the veteran side this time. Pro bono work, obviously. The irony was almost painful. Why would veterans trust me after what happened? "They don't," Rodriguez said bluntly. "But Mr. Henshaw believes in second chances, believes people can change if properly motivated. Do you want to prove him right?" 2 weeks after Marine One descended on Havenbrook, Walter received another call from Washington, this time the president himself. "Mr. Henshaw, I'm hosting a ceremony at the White House. Nothing major, just recognizing Americans who exemplify the values we sometimes forget. Your name came up in our planning session. All of about 3 seconds into the meeting," Walter chuckled. "Not sure I'm the White House type, Mr. President." "Few people are," the president admitted. "That's what makes their visits meaningful. Besides, I hear you have some thoughts on the farm bill we're about to debate. Care to share them with Congress directly?" The ceremony took place on a crisp October morning. Walter wore his dress Marine Corps uniform, still fitting remarkably well, despite 6 decades of civilian living. Sarah accompanied him, her pride evident in every gesture. The East Room held perhaps 50 guests, farmers, veterans, community leaders, all selected for their dedication to preserving the values that built America. Chad Beaumont sat in the back row, barely recognizable in his humility. He was there at Walter's invitation, serving now as a volunteer coordinator for the VA's foreclosure prevention program. The president's speech was personal and direct. The people in this room represent something essential about America. Not the America of headlines and controversies, but the America of barn raisings and community cookouts, of neighbors helping neighbors and strangers becoming friends. They remind us that power without purpose is meaningless, and that true strength lies in lifting others up, not putting them down. When Walter received his award, a civilian honor rarely bestowed, he stood at the podium and scanned the audience. His eyes found Beaumont last. Change is hard, Walter said. Admitting fault is harder. Making amends is hardest of all. But it's necessary, not for forgiveness from others, but for peace with ourselves. This country was built by people, brave enough to change, to grow, to acknowledge mistakes and do better. That's not weakness, that's wisdom. After the ceremony in the Rose Garden, Walter found himself standing with the president one final time. "The Farm Bill vote is next week," the president said. "Think we've got it right this time?" Walter considered the months of consultation, the input from actual farmers, the provisions for veterans and rural communities. "It's better," he allowed, "but there's always room for improvement. That's what I like about you, Sergeant. Never satisfied, always pushing for better." The president paused. "I'm creating a permanent advisory board for rural affairs. Want to chair it?" Walter looked across the rose garden to where Sarah stood talking with other guests. "On one condition, the meetings happen in flyover country, not just Washington. You can't understand rural America from behind a desk. Deal." 6 months later, the first meeting of the Presidential Advisory Board on Rural Affairs convened in Havenbrook, Missouri. Policymakers, farmers, veterans, and community leaders gathered in the restored Grange Hall, sitting around tables assembled from barn doors and sawhorses. The contrast with the polished mahogany of Washington conference rooms could not have been more stark. Chad Beaumont attended as well, no longer an auctioneer, but a changed man serving those he'd once dismissed. His work with the VA had earned grudging respect, if not complete forgiveness. Some wounds take time to heal, but the process had begun. Walter opened the meeting with characteristic directness. "Welcome to real America. No press, no cameras, just honest conversation about serving the people who keep this country fed and grounded." The discussions continued through lunch, potluck dishes brought by local families, and into the afternoon. Agricultural experts learned about the practical challenges of their theories. VA administrators heard directly from veterans struggling with rural access issues. And politicians discovered that their constituents weren't statistics or demographics, but people with faces, names, and dreams worth preserving. As the sun set over Missouri fields that would never be auction lots, Walter reflected on the strange journey that had brought him here. From a man facing foreclosure to a voice for rural America, all because someone had seen beyond the gray hair and weathered hands to the service and sacrifice beneath. That evening, as board members gathered for dinner at his farmhouse, no, Fancy catering, just Sarah's pot roast and homemade pie. Walter's phone rang one last time. This is the White House operator. The president would like a word. Walter, the familiar voice came on the line. I just got the preliminary recommendations from today's meeting. Excellent work. But I want to know, how's the family? The family? America's extended family. The farmers, the veterans, the forgotten folks who keep things running while we make noise in Washington. Are we finally getting it right? Walter looked around his table at faces representing that family. Diverse, weathered, hopeful. We're getting closer, he said. But there's always more work to do. After hanging up, he returned to his guests, raising his coffee cup in a toast. To those who serve, he said simply, in uniform and overalls, in battle and barns, in sickness and health, to the real America that keeps going, no matter what. The toast was drunk to the sound of clinking mugs and the distant whistle of a train passing through Havenbrook, carrying grain to markets and dreams to destinations unknown. Change was never easy, Walter knew, but it was possible. One presidential visit, one act of justice, one voice speaking truth to power could ripple outward, touching more lives than anyone imagined. And sometimes, just sometimes, those ripples became waves, washing away the old assumptions and prejudices, leaving behind something new and better. Not perfect, never perfect, but better. As his guests departed into the night, Walter stood on his porch one more time, watching stars emerge over fields that would see another planting season, another harvest, another generation of Henshaws working the land. Behind him, Sarah began clearing dishes. You never told me if you planned to accept the permanent advisory position, she said. Walter smiled. Already did. Someone's got to remind Washington that real people live between the coasts. Might as well be me. Might as well, Sarah agreed, joining him on the porch. Though I think it's more than that. You're building something, Dad. A bridge between forgotten and remembered. Or maybe just reminding folks they're connected, Walter replied. That we all depend on each other more than we know. A coyote howled in the distance, answered by another, then another, until a chorus arose across the Missouri night. Life continuing, cycles repeating, seasons turning, and beneath it all, the steady heartbeat of America, not the America of headlines and controversies, but the America of work-worn hands and opened hearts, of neighbors helping neighbors, and communities standing together. Walter Henshaw, two-time Purple Heart recipient, Silver Star holder, DSC winner, presidential advisor and Missouri farmer, stood on his porch and surveyed his domain. Not just the fields and buildings that had nearly been lost, but the larger landscape he now helped shape. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to serve. But tonight, under stars that had witnessed generations of struggle and triumph, all was well in his corner of the world, and sometimes that was enough. Spring arrived in Havenbrook with the sudden intensity of a military offensive. Flowers burst through earth that had seemed permanently frozen, and Walter Henshaw found himself busier than he'd been in decades. His role as presidential advisor had expanded beyond anyone's expectations, including his own. The Kansas City Star ran a headline that somehow found its way to his kitchen table. Farm saved veteran transforms White House policy. Sarah pinned it to the refrigerator beside kindergarten art projects from Hope's grandchildren. Local pride had never shone brighter. Today, Walter was preparing for what he'd begun calling farm summits, meetings where Washington came to the heartland, instead of demanding the reverse. His barn had been converted into a conference center of sorts. though it still smelled of hay and retained its rustic character. Folding chairs replaced hay bales, but the essence remained. Marcus Blackwell arrived early, transformed from the hard-nosed banker who'd authorized the foreclosure. "The changes have been remarkable," he told Walter over coffee. "We've renegotiated 47 farm loans based on the model we developed for your situation. Not one foreclosure this quarter." Jake Morrison joined them, his prosthetic arm now visible as he preferred it. No hidden shame, just honest acknowledgement of sacrifice. "VA's mobile units start next month," he reported. 5 qualified for Missouri alone, finally bringing health care to those who can't drive 2 hours for an appointment. Walter nodded. Small victories add up. The day's summit focused on succession planning, helping aging farmers transition their operations to younger generations or capable stewards rather than corporate raiders. Attendees included agriculture secretaries, state representatives, local farmers, and surprisingly, Chad Beaumont. Beaumont had arrived before most guests, helping arrange chairs and set up tables. His expensive suits had been replaced by simple workwear. His manicured hands now bore calluses from honest labor. When he caught Walter's eye, a moment of understanding passed between them. "Is this the man who nearly ruined everything?" whispered a congressional aide, not realizing Beaumont could hear. "No," Walter said clearly. "This is the man who learned how to make things right." The summit proceeded with remarkable productivity. Barriers between policymakers and practitioners seemed to dissolve around Walter's kitchen table. City officials discovered rural realities, while farmers learned to articulate their needs beyond frustration and anger. During a break, Walter noticed Beaumont standing alone, watching younger farmers laugh together. "You did good today," Walter told him. "Helping instead of hurting." "I still wake up hearing myself at that auction," Beaumont admitted. The tone of voice, the smug superiority. I was that person, completely convinced of my own importance. "Better to wake up changed than remain comfortably ignorant," Walter observed. An unexpected visitor appeared at the barn's entrance. Thomas Winston, the Secretary of Veterans Affairs. "Forgive the intrusion," he said, "but we have news too important to wait." The summit participants gathered as Winston explained the new legislation passing through Congress. The Veterans Rural Access Initiative, fully funded, comprehensive, mobile health care, job training, and farm mentorship programs. Mr. Henshaw's testimony was instrumental. "We're calling it the Henshaw Protocol." Walter felt his throat tighten. "That's unnecessary." "Necessary," Winston corrected firmly, "and overdue." That evening, after the last summiteer had departed, Walter found himself alone with Sarah in the quiet barn. Congress had indeed passed the initiative. Rural communities would finally receive attention long denied, and somehow he'd become a name attached to positive change. "I worry about expectations," he confessed. "What if I can't maintain this momentum?" Sarah squeezed his hand. "You already have. The change isn't in Washington, Dad. It's here, in people remembering what matters." The next morning brought another crisis to the advisory board's attention. A major agricultural conglomerate had announced plans to buy out 15 family farms in neighboring counties, threatening to turn them into industrial operations. The local farmers were desperate. Walter's phone rang constantly as panicked neighbors sought guidance. The crisis required immediate attention, and once again Walter found himself at the center of power dynamics he'd never imagined navigating. He scheduled an emergency video conference with the president. "Sir, We need to discuss predatory acquisition practices. The president appeared on screen from Air Force One. I heard about AgriCorp's maneuver. What do you recommend? Walter detailed a strategic response involving federal oversight of agricultural mergers, state-level protection for family farms, and tax incentives for maintaining traditional operations. These aren't just farms you're saving, he emphasized. They're communities, traditions, ways of life that can't be replicated by corporate efficiency. The president listened, asked questions, and then made several calls while Walter watched. Within an hour, federal regulators had announced new scrutiny of large agricultural mergers. AgriCorp's stock dropped 3%, and local farmers breathed easier. Your voice carries weight, the president observed. Use it wisely. 3 months after Marine One had first touched down in Havenbrook, Walter received an invitation to address the National Press Club. Sarah insisted on accompanying him, worried about the overwhelming nature of Washington attention. The press club was a different audience entirely. Skeptical reporters accustomed to carefully crafted political messaging. Walter approached the podium with the same determination he'd shown facing enemy fire. "I'm a farmer," he began simply, "not a politician, not a policy expert, just a man who nearly lost everything my family built over 9 generations. He described the day of the auction, Beaumont's cruelty, the miracle of presidential intervention. But more importantly, he spoke about the thousands like him facing similar fates silently, without helicopters bringing salvation. The real story isn't about one farmer getting saved, Walter concluded. It's about a nation remembering that its strength comes from its roots. When we neglect our rural communities, our veterans, our traditions, we weaken the foundation on which everything else is built. The questions that followed were tough, sharp, designed to find inconsistencies or political agenda. Walter answered each with patience and honesty, explaining complex issues in simple terms without condescension. A senior correspondent from the Washington Post asked the final question. "With all due respect, Mr. Henshaw, what qualifies you to reshape national agricultural policy?" "The same thing that qualified me to fight for this country," Walter replied. "I care deeply about preserving what makes us great, and I'm willing to put in the work even when it's hard." The answer, simple and heartfelt, earned rare applause from the cynical press corps. That evening, Walter and Sarah attended a White House state dinner in honor of a visiting foreign dignitary. Walter's dress uniform, meticulously maintained over decades, drew respectful nods from military aides and foreign generals alike. During the dinner, the president made an announcement. "We have among us tonight a man whose story represents the best of America, Walter Henshaw, farmer, Marine, and now my conscience when it comes to understanding rural America. Thanks to his insight, we're embarking on the most comprehensive rural support initiative in decades." The applause was thunderous, but Walter remained humble. After dinner, the visiting dignitary sought him out. "I served in my nation's military." "You too," the general said. "We understand each other." "Service takes many forms," Walter replied, "but the principles remain the same. Duty, honor, sacrifice." Back in Havenbrook, Walter discovered that fame had brought both opportunities and challenges. A major publisher wanted his memoirs. Universities sought him for commencement speeches. Businesses offered consulting contracts that could have made him wealthy. He declined them all, maintaining his focus on the advisory board and his farm. "Money was never the point," he told Sarah, "and if I start collecting fancy titles, I'll become exactly what needs changing." Chad Beaumont, meanwhile, had found his own path to redemption. His work with the VA had expanded into a national program, teaching other auctioneers and estate liquidators about dignified treatment of veterans facing financial hardship. "I can never undo what I said," he told a group of new VA volunteers, Walter's words from months ago echoing in his approach. "But I can dedicate what time I have left to doing better." The day after his return from Washington, Walter called a town meeting in Havenbrook. The high school gymnasium filled with residents eager to hear about life in the corridors of power. "The most important lesson I learned," Walter told them, "is that Washington isn't some distant fortress. It's staffed by people who've forgotten where they came from. They need reminding, and we're the ones who need to do the reminding." He detailed the initiatives taking shape: rural healthcare, agricultural innovation centers, veteran job programs. But more important than the programs themselves was the shift in perspective they represented. "When they look at a map now," Walter said, "they see people, not just empty space between cities. They remember that this is where their food comes, from where their veterans settle, where American values are still lived daily, not just discussed in theory." The town responded with enthusiastic cheers, but Walter wasn't finished. "This attention won't last forever," he warned. "We need to build on it now, create structures that survive after the cameras leave. Your voice matters if you use it." The meeting ended with practical planning sessions, community leaders organizing to maintain momentum, farmers forming cooperative boards, veterans establishing support networks. The energy was palpable, hope taking tangible form. Later that evening, Walter sat on his porch with Sarah, watching fireflies dance across fields that would see another harvest. His phone chimed with a text from the White House. Congressional funding for rural initiatives had passed with bipartisan support. "We're changing things," Sarah observed. "We're remembering things," Walter corrected. "Remembering what matters." A convoy of military vehicles appeared on the horizon, not threatening this time, but reverential. A training exercise had been routed past Walter's farm as a mark of respect. Young soldiers saluted as they passed, many still teenagers younger than Walter had been when he'd first donned the uniform. "Do they know why?" Sarah asked. "Maybe not all the details," Walter replied, "but they know the spirit. That's what endures." The next morning brought news of another pending foreclosure in a neighboring county. This time, it wasn't just Walter responding, but an entire network of support. Bankers who'd learned to see beyond balance sheets, politicians attuned to constituent needs, community members ready to rally around their own. The crisis was resolved. Within hours, the pattern set by Marine One's visit now replicated through ordinary channels of extraordinary care. Walter's final video conference of the week revealed something unexpected: a trend of young veterans returning to rural communities, drawn by the support systems now in place. The exodus from small towns was beginning to reverse. "You've started something larger than saving one farm," the president noted. "You've sparked a movement." "Not me," Walter insisted. "All of us. That's the point." As spring deepened into early summer, Walter found himself less surprised by daily miracles. The bank president who once authorized foreclosures now toured farms with compassionate eyes. The auctioneer who'd mocked service now served those who'd served. And an entire nation, for a brief shining moment, remembered that its greatest treasures weren't locked in vaults, but growing in fields, living in small towns, carried in the hearts of forgotten heroes. Walter Henshaw had become a symbol, but Symbols only matter if they inspire action, and action, he'd learned, begins with simple truths spoken in plain language, backed by unwavering conviction. As evening fell over his beloved fields, Walter raised a cup of coffee in silent toast to all who served, all who struggled, all who persevered. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but yesterday had proven that even the mightiest can be moved by the voice of one who refuses to be silenced. And sometimes, just sometimes, that voice arrives wrapped in weathered skin and carried on winds of justice, touching down precisely where needed most. The fireflies continued their ancient dance, stars emerged above Missouri soil, and life went on, immeasurably richer for lessons learned and bridges built between forgotten and remembered America. In the distance, a train whistle sounded, not carrying away lost dreams this time, but bringing home those who'd been gone too long, called back by the promise that rural America still had room for heroes, still valued sacrifice, still remembered how to honor those who'd given everything. And in that remembering, found a path forward that honored the past while embracing the future. The morning sun had barely crested the horizon when Walter found himself staring at a letter bearing the presidential seal. The heavy cardstock felt both familiar and alien. In his calloused hands, Sarah watched from across the kitchen table, coffee steaming untouched in front of her. "You promised you'd read it right away," she reminded him. Walter's thumb traced the eagle embossed on the envelope before he broke the seal. His reading glasses, seldom worn but necessary now, perched on his nose as he scanned the formal language. Then his shoulders straightened, a posture decades of civilian life hadn't erased. "They want me to establish a permanent foundation," he said slowly. "The Henshaw Institute for Rural Veterans, full government backing, private endowments ready to commit, national scope." Sarah's eyes widened. Dad, that's huge." "It's something," Walter agreed, setting the letter down. "Not sure I'm the right man for institutions." Outside, the sound of vehicles interrupted their conversation. Not just a truck this time, but a motorcade of black SUVs. The lead vehicle stopped, and a woman in a crisp suit emerged, followed by several others. Walter recognized her from video conferences, Director Chen from the Office of Rural Affairs. "Mr. Henshaw," she called as Walter stepped onto the porch. "The president didn't want to wait for your response. He sent us to help make decisions easier." By noon, Walter's living room had transformed into an impromptu boardroom. Laptops and legal pads covered every surface. Sarah had taken one look at the organized chaos and retreated to the barn to feed the horses. The foundation would centralize all rural veteran initiatives, Director Chen explained, pointing to charts and diagrams. Healthcare, housing, agricultural support, education. Everything your town meetings identified as critical. Walter studied the plans carefully. Who controls the board? Washington bureaucrats who've never stepped foot in farm country? "That's why you chair it," Chen responded. "Full autonomy to appoint board members, budget authority, direct line to the president for critical issues. Think of it as taking what worked here in Havenbrook and spreading it across America." The afternoon stretched into evening as they debated structure, funding, and philosophy. Jake Morrison arrived, offering his perspective as both veteran and beneficiary of the new systems. Marcus Blackwell stopped by, explaining how banking regulations had already shifted because of Walter's influence. At dinner, Sarah's pot roast, served family-style to government officials who'd probably never eaten in a farmhouse. Chad Beaumont appeared at the door. He carried a simple box wrapped in brown paper. "I won't intrude on your meeting," he said to Walter, "but I wanted you to have this before any final decisions." Inside the box lay a leather-bound journal filled with Beaumont's handwriting. The first page bore a single line: "Lessons from the man I tried to destroy." "I've been documenting everything since that day," Beaumont explained. "Every veteran I've helped, every foreclosure prevented, every life touched by the ripple effect. Thought you should know the full scope of what your mercy created." Later, alone in his office, Walter read entries spanning months of service and transformation. Beaumont had kept detailed records of every case, every success, every failure. The final entry, dated from yesterday: "Mr. H teaches that redemption is earned daily, not declared once. Tomorrow I continue earning." Dawn brought another surprise. A crowd had gathered at the farm's entrance, veterans from across Missouri and beyond. Some wore old unit patches, others fresh prosthetics. All bore the look of men and women who'd served and suffered. Jake Morrison stepped forward as spokesman. "Word travels fast in the veteran community. We heard about the foundation. Wanted to tell you directly. We support whatever you decide. If you take this on, we're behind you. If you don't, we understand." A young woman in her 20s pushed through the crowd. "Corporal Jessica Martinez," she introduced herself, "lost both legs in Afghanistan. The mobile VA unit you pushed for saved my life, not just medically, but spiritually. I've got my farm now, small, but mine. You gave me that future." One by one, others shared similar stories. The ripple effect Beaumont had documented was larger than anyone imagined. Veterans building new lives, communities healing, rural America. Remembering its strength, Walter's decision crystallized as the sun climbed higher. He returned to the living room where Director Chen waited with barely concealed anticipation. "I'll do it," he announced. "But not from Washington. The headquarters stays here in Havenbrook. We build out from the heartland, not from the capital." Chen smiled. "The president thought you'd say that. The paperwork's already drawn up with that provision." Within weeks, construction began on a modest complex at the edge of Walter's property. Not the glass and steel monument to bureaucracy that Washington preferred, but a structure that honored its surroundings. Reclaimed barnwood, local stone, solar panels alongside traditional design. The first meeting of the Henshaw Institute's board took place in the completed facility 3 months later. Walter had assembled an unlikely group: farmers and generals, small-town bankers and VA administrators, veterans of every war since Korea. No lobbyists, no political appointees, just people who understood service and sacrifice. "This isn't about creating another government agency," Walter told them. "It's about building bridges between those who've forgotten and those who've been forgotten. Every decision we make, every program we create, has to serve real people with real problems." His phone rang daily with requests for advice, assistance, intervention. Politicians seeking rural voter approval learned quickly that Walter didn't trade endorsements for favors. Corporate interests discovered that his influence couldn't be bought with donations. His only currency was results that made actual lives better. Sarah took on increasing responsibilities as Walter's schedule grew impossible. She managed correspondence, screened requests, and kept her father grounded in reality. "Remember," she'd tell him each morning, "you're still the same man who almost lost this farm. Don't forget who you are." A year into the Foundation's existence, Beaumont had fully transformed from pariah to trusted ally. His program training estate liquidators in compassionate foreclosure practices had become mandatory in 3 states. He'd found purpose in service, redemption in helping rather than hurting. One evening, as Walter reviewed case files, Beaumont stopped by unannounced. "There's something you should know," he said, settling into the worn armchair opposite Walter's desk. "AgriCorp, the company that tried to buy out those 15 farms, they're back." Walter set down his papers. "Same tactics? Subtler. They've learned from last time, found loopholes in the new regulations." Beaumont pulled out his laptop, displaying financial records and legal documents. "But I've been tracking them. Thought you should have this information before they make their move." The intelligence proved invaluable. When AgriCorp's lawyers arrived with their new strategy, they found Walter, Jake, Marcus, and Beaumont waiting with counter-proposals that protected every threatened farm while offering the corporation legitimate investment opportunities that wouldn't destroy communities. "You're supposed to be on our side," one frustrated executive complained to Beaumont. "I am," Beaumont replied quietly. "I'm on the side of doing it right." As news of the successful negotiations spread, other communities facing similar threats reached out to the Henshaw Institute. The model expanded. Local advisory boards, mobile response teams, a network of reform professionals like Beaumont who'd learned better ways to conduct business. The president visited Havenbrook again on the Foundation's 2nd anniversary. No motorcade this time, just Marine One setting down in the familiar pasture where it had first changed Walter's life. "You've exceeded every expectation," the president told Walter as they walked the property. "Rural suicide rates down, veteran homelessness dropping, family farms stabilizing. And it all traces back to one day when we remembered to honor our heroes. Not heroes," Walter corrected gently, "just people who kept going when it got hard. That's what we all do out here. The Foundation's success brought inevitable challenges. Federal bureaucrats tried to impose regulations that would have crippled its flexibility. Political appointees attempted to redirect its focus toward headline-grabbing projects rather than quiet, essential work. Each time, Walter responded with the same stubborn integrity that had carried him through decades of farming and warfare. "The mission doesn't change," became his mantra. "We serve those who can't serve themselves anymore. Everything else is noise." A crisp October morning, 3 years after Marine One's dramatic arrival, Walter sat on his porch with Sarah, reviewing the Foundation's latest impact report. Thousands of veterans housed, tens of thousands more receiving support, rural communities stabilizing across the nation. "Think Dad would be proud?" Walter asked, referring to his father who'd passed the farm to him decades ago. "He'd be proud you kept it," Sarah replied, "and that you used it to help others keep theirs." A familiar sound interrupted their reflection. The distinctive whump of helicopter rotors, not Marine One this time, but a smaller aircraft bearing VA markings. It landed in the designated field the Foundation now maintained for such visits. A young doctor emerged, medical bag in hand. "Mobile unit making rounds," she explained. "We've got 6 farms to visit today. Mr. Henshaw wanted to thank you personally for making this possible." As the helicopter lifted off toward its first patient, Walter watched with satisfaction. The system worked because it was built by those who understood need, not just policy. Later that week, during a video conference with Foundation chapters across the country, Walter noticed something remarkable. Every face on screen showed the same determined expression he saw in mirrors. People who'd chosen service over self, community over convenience. "We've changed how this country thinks about rural veterans," one chapter leader reported from Oregon. "Banks are offering better terms. Politicians are listening. People are coming home." After the call ended, Walter found a handwritten note on his desk. Beaumont's distinctive script thanked him for another year of purpose, another year of making amends through action rather than words. The evening brought family dinner. Sarah, her children, and now grandchildren gathering in the farmhouse that had witnessed so much history. Young voices mixed with elder wisdom, future generations hearing stories of struggle and triumph. "Tell us about the helicopter day, Grandpa," his youngest grandchild demanded, eyes wide with anticipation. Walter smiled, pulling the child onto his lap. "Once upon a time," he began, as he had countless times before, "this farm nearly became someone else's. But the story had changed in the telling, no longer just about salvation arriving from above, but about communities saving themselves, about men like Beaumont learning to build instead of destroy, about systems changing because individuals refused to accept injustice." As September faded into October, bringing harvest time to Missouri fields, Walter received notice of one final honor. The Presidential Medal of Freedom would be awarded at a White House ceremony, recognizing his transformation of rural veteran services. "Don't feel comfortable with all this attention," he told Sarah the night before leaving for Washington. "It's not about you anymore, Dad," she replied wisely. "It's about everyone you've helped. You're just the face they put on it." The ceremony attracted rural representatives from across America. Veterans organizations, farming groups, small-town officials, all gathered to witness one of their own receive the nation's highest civilian honor. The president's remarks echoed themes now familiar to all who knew Walter's work. True leadership inspires others to lead. True service creates systems of service. True change begins with one voice refusing to be silenced. When Walter stepped forward to receive the medal, he spoke briefly but powerfully. "This honor belongs to every veteran fighting to keep their land, every farmer preserving their family's legacy, every community member who refused to let their neighbor struggle alone. We rise together, or not at all." Back in Havenbrook, life continued its essential rhythms. The foundation operated with quiet efficiency, its impact measured in lives preserved and communities strengthened. Walter returned to his daily rounds. Farm work in the morning, foundation business in the afternoon, always home for dinner. One evening, months after the medal ceremony, he sat on his porch watching sunset paint the Missouri sky. Sarah joined him with 2 glasses of lemonade. "Remember when this was just a farm-facing auction?" she asked. Walter nodded. "Remember when I thought I'd failed? Funny how failure looks different when you're standing on the other side of it." They sat in comfortable silence as stars emerged. In the distance, a train whistle carried across fields that would feed another generation. The Henshaw name would endure not because of awards or recognition, but because it stood for something larger: the stubborn refusal to abandon either land or honor. As midnight approached, Walter's phone chimed with a message from the foundation's night staff. Another veteran in crisis, another farm facing foreclosure, another opportunity to prove that help exists for those who've given everything and asked for nothing. Walter stood, stretching muscles that protested more each year, but never quit. "Duty calls," he said simply. Always does, Sarah agreed, and you always answer, because some men are defined not by what they receive, but by what they give, not by honors accumulated, but by burdens shared, not by power wielded, but by power surrendered in service to others. Walter Henshaw had learned this truth on frozen Korean hillsides and in dusty Missouri fields, in moments of triumph and seasons of despair. And now, through the Institute bearing his name and the countless lives it touched, that truth spread, like seeds on fertile ground, taking root wherever honest need met honest help. The wind picked up, carrying scents of growing corn and distant autumn. In his office, another case file waited. Another family needed saving. Another community required strength, and Walter would answer, as he always had, as he always would, until his watch finally ended and others took up the call. For in the end, service never truly concludes. It merely passes to worthy hands, generation to generation, keeping alive the simple truth that America remains great because its heroes refuse to let anyone face storms alone. The screen door closed behind him, and lights burned late into the Missouri night as one man continued his long battle against forgetting, proving daily that justice sometimes arrives on helicopter wings, but always endures through human hands willing to work for something larger than themselves. Morning fog clung to the valleys surrounding Havenbrook as Walter prepared for what he hoped would be a routine day at the Henshaw Institute. 5 years had passed since Marine One first touched down on his land, transforming him from a farmer facing foreclosure to a national advocate for rural veterans. The foundation had grown beyond anything he'd envisioned, yet the simplicity of his morning rituals remained unchanged. Sarah appeared at his office door with coffee and concern etched across her face. "Dad, we've got a situation. The Bureau of Agricultural Affairs is conducting a surprise audit of our programs." Walter sipped his coffee slowly. Audits were nothing new, but surprise investigations usually meant someone had complained. Who's heading it? Lawrence Hamilton, the new administrator appointed by Congress. The name triggered recognition. Hamilton had been one of AgriCorp's chief lobbyists before his government appointment, a man who'd profited from the very practices Walter's foundation sought to prevent. The audit team arrived in 3 government SUVs, led by Hamilton himself. His designer suit contrasted sharply with Havenbrook's rural atmosphere. "Mr. Henshaw," he said, extending a hand. Walter reluctantly shook. "I'm sure you understand the need for oversight when public funds are involved." "Oversight's fine," Walter replied. "Harassment isn't." Hamilton's smile didn't reach his eyes. "We've received complaints about preferential treatment, improper documentation, possible violations of federal lending guidelines." Jake Morrison stepped forward, prosthetic arm visible as always. "Might want to specify whose complaints you're investigating." For the next 3 hours, Hamilton's team pored through every file, questioned every procedure, and scrutinized every penny spent. Walter watched with growing suspicion as they focused particularly on cases where the foundation had prevented foreclosures against major agricultural corporations. "This one's interesting," Hamilton called out, holding up a case file. "The Meadowbrook farm near Springfield, saved from foreclosure despite being $200,000 in arrears. How exactly did this work?" Sarah stepped forward, her professional composure matching Hamilton's bureaucratic demeanor. "John Meadowbrook is a 2-tour Marine veteran. His medical bills from service-related injuries exceeded his ability to maintain payments during drought conditions. We worked with local lenders to restructure his debt based on land productivity, not arbitrary intra-schedules. Restructured by whose authority? Hamilton pressed. Walter intervened. By the authority of common decency. We didn't change any laws. We just reminded banks about programs they ignored. Hamilton's phone buzzed repeatedly during the examination. He took one call outside, returning with an expression Walter had seen on opposing commanders when their plans unraveled. "I'll need to take this higher," Hamilton announced. "There are procedures for restructuring veteran loans, and they appear to have been circumvented." That evening, Walter called an emergency board meeting. Around the table sat the usual faces, plus several empty chairs belonging to members trapped in Washington by unexpected congressional hearings. Chad Beaumont, now fully integrated as the Foundation's chief of volunteer operations, reviewed the day's events. "Hamilton found nothing illegal," Beaumont concluded, "because we've done nothing illegal. But he's creating a narrative of impropriety. Someone wants us shut down." Jake slammed his prosthetic hand on the table. "Let them try. The veterans we've helped won't stand for it." "It's not about what we've done," Walter observed quietly. "It's about who we've hurt. Every foreclosure prevented, every family farm saved. That's potential profit denied to corporations like AgriCorp." Sarah pulled up financial records on her laptop. "Look at this. Hamilton's appointment was pushed through by 3 senators, all recipients of major AgriCorp donations." The pattern became clear. A calculated attack disguised as routine oversight, but Walter had learned in Korea that the best defense often involved unexpected offense. "Set up a video conference for tomorrow," he ordered. "Every board member, every chapter head, every veteran who's been helped by our programs. Hamilton wants oversight. Let's give him transparency." The next morning, Hamilton arrived expecting continued examination of files. Instead, he walked into a packed auditorium where the Foundation had set up a live-streamed town hall. Veterans from every state shared stories of how the Henshaw Institute had saved their homes, their farms, their dignity. "You want impropriety?" called out a Vietnam veteran from Nebraska. "How about banks foreclosing on disabled vets who serve 3 tours while their executives get $1 million bonuses?" Hamilton tried to maintain control. "This isn't the appropriate forum." "It's exactly the appropriate forum," Walter countered. "Real oversight means seeing real results, not just numbers on paper." For 3 hours, veterans testified. Local bankers explained how the Foundation's approach had actually reduced default rates by treating borrowers as people instead of statistics. Even some congressional aides watching the live stream began texting questions to their employers about their AgriCorp connections. By noon, Hamilton had retreated to his SUV, making frantic calls to Washington. Walter found him pacing outside the auditorium. "You've made powerful enemies," Hamilton warned, perhaps genuinely concerned. "Had them all along," Walter replied. "Just took them a while to notice we were winning." That evening brought vindication from an unexpected source. The Inspector General for the Department of Agriculture announced an investigation into complaints of improper influence in the appointment of Lawrence Hamilton. Within hours, AgriCorp's stock took a beating as news outlets picked up the story of corporate attempt to undermine veteran support programs. Chad Beaumont found Walter alone in his office, staring at television coverage of the unfolding scandal. "Remember when all you wanted was to save your farm?" he asked. "Still all I want," Walter replied. "Just expanded my definition of farm." The president called personally that night. "Interesting press conference today," he observed. The opposition didn't expect you to fight back so publicly. They forgot we learned to fight for what matters, Walter said. Can't bureaucratize courage. Weeks passed as the investigation into Hamilton's appointment proceeded. AgriCorp's influence campaign collapsed under scrutiny. Several senators found themselves explaining campaign donations to uncomfortable constituents. And the Henshaw Institute continued its work now with increased public support. On a crisp November morning, Walter found himself addressing the National Farmers Bureau Conference. Hamilton sat in the audience, newly resigned from government service, facing potential corruption charges stemming from his corporate connections. "This isn't about me versus them," Walter told the assembled farmers. "It's about remembering that agriculture built this nation, that veterans preserved it, that when we forget either truth, we all suffer." After the speech, Hamilton approached with unusual humility. "I didn't understand what your foundation really does," he admitted. "Saw the numbers, missed the people." Walter nodded. "Might want to tell that to the judge at your hearing." "Already planning to," Hamilton replied. "Can't undo my mistakes, but maybe can prevent others from making them." The conversation reminded Walter of another redemption arc, Beaumont's journey from arrogant auctioneer to dedicated advocate. Perhaps change was always possible for those willing to see beyond their own interests. Winter settled over Havenbrook, bringing its annual challenges to rural communities. But this year, the Henshaw Institute stood ready with programs strengthened by surviving attempted destruction. Satellite offices had opened in 30 states. Mobile VA units covered previously underserved regions, and perhaps most importantly, former enemies like Beaumont and now Hamilton had become powerful advocates for change. One morning, Sarah burst into Walter's office with news. "Dad, you need to see this." On her tablet screen, a familiar video played. Not the viral footage of Marine One's arrival, but newer content showing Hamilton testifying before Congress. "The Henshaw Institute saved my career from becoming my destruction," he told the committee. "When you try to destroy something that serves others, you reveal your own corruption." The irony wasn't lost on Walter. The man sent to shut them down had become their most articulate defender. Later that week, Congress passed the Rural Veterans Protection Act, officially codifying many of the Foundation's practices and protecting them from future corporate interference. The President signed it in Havenbrook, turning Walter's modest farm into a symbol of governmental success for once. "You've changed how we think about rural America," the President declared at the signing ceremony. "Proved that service never retires, sacrifice never fades, and community matters more than profit." Walter accepted the accolades with characteristic modesty, but privately he knew the real victory lay in thousands of small triumphs: farms saved, veterans housed, communities preserved. Each success, another thread in the tapestry of rural American resilience. As years passed, the Henshaw Institute became so integral to rural veteran support that people forgot it hadn't always existed. Walter gradually stepped back from daily operations, trusting Sarah and a new generation of leaders to carry forward the mission. On the 10th anniversary of Marine One's dramatic arrival, Walter found himself reflecting on a journey he'd never anticipated. From farmer facing ruin to national advocate, from silent suffering to powerful voice, the transformation still sometimes felt like someone else's story. Jake Morrison joined him on the porch that evening. "Think about what we've built," Jake, imbued, Millions helped because one man refused to accept injustice. Millions helped because everyone who could did, Walter corrected. That's the lesson worth remembering. As sunset painted the Missouri sky, news helicopters gathered in the distance. Another president was coming to honor the Henshaw Institute's achievements. But Walter knew the real story wasn't in grand ceremonies. It was in empty auction blocks, full farmhouses, and veterans sleeping peacefully in homes they'd earned but nearly lost. The wind carried familiar sounds: corn rustling, cattle lowing, children playing. Simple sounds of continuity in a world that sometimes forgot to honor its roots. But here in Havenbrook, in foundations built by ordinary courage and extraordinary persistence, those roots ran deep and strong. And Walter Henshaw, once just a farmer, facing foreclosure, had helped ensure they always would. As darkness fell and the latest presidential helicopter approached, Walter remained on his porch, watching stars emerge over land that represented so much more than property lines. Here, in this intersection of service and salvation, ordinary people had proven that justice sometimes arrives on unexpected wings, that redemption flows from unlikely sources, and that America remains great because some refuse to let greatness die. The helicopter's landing lights swept across fields where futures had been saved and dreams preserved. Another ceremony awaited, another honor to accept with humility. But the real celebration continued in every veteran keeping their land, every farmer passing tradition to the next generation, every community remembering that strength comes from standing together. Walter rose slowly, age evident in movement but not in spirit. The foundation he'd built would outlast him, would touch lives yet unborn, would prove indefinitely that one voice raised in truth could start an echo that never fully faded. As he walked toward the landing zone to greet another president, Sarah appeared at his side. "Ready for more recognition?" she asked. "Ready for more service," he replied. "That's what this was always about." And in that simple truth lay everything the Henshaw Institute represented: service over self, community over convenience, dignity over profit, a marine's lesson, a farmer's wisdom, a nation's reminder that its greatest strength lay not in the halls of power, but in the hearts of those who remembered why power mattered. The helicopter touched down, its rotors stirring dust from earth that held stories of struggle and triumph stretching back generations. Walter squared his shoulders, preparing once more to speak for those whose voices needed amplification. Because some stories never truly end. They simply find new ways to be told, new lives to touch, new futures to shape. And the tale of how one elderly farmer stood against an arrogant auctioneer and sparked a movement that transformed a nation. That story had only just begun. The anniversary celebration brought unexpected rain to Havenbrook, but Walter Henshaw watched it with satisfaction. 12 years had passed since Marine One's arrival, and now the Henshaw Institute operated in all 50 states with international branches in 5 countries. The rain meant crops would grow strong, and strong crops meant preserved farms and communities. Inside the Foundation's state-of-the-art conference center, built with eco-friendly materials and veteran-employed labor, Sarah presided over the annual board meeting. Her father, now 95 and using a cane, sat as honorary chairman, his eyes still sharp beneath weathered brows. "We've prevented 12,147 foreclosures this year alone," Sarah reported, "housed 5,200 homeless veterans, and created sustainable agricultural programs in 47 countries. Dad's approach has become the gold standard for rural development worldwide. Walter nodded approvingly. Age had slowed his body, but sharpened his perspective. He watched with pride as his granddaughter Claire, now leading the Foundation's international division, outlined their newest initiative, using veterans to train farmers in emerging nations, sharing both agricultural and leadership skills. "Grandpa taught us that service multiplies when shared," Claire explained to visiting dignitaries from 3 continents. "We're not just saving farms anymore. We're building a global community of those who understand sacrifice and stewardship." The global expansion had been Jake Morrison's idea. His prosthetic arm, now a sophisticated bionic device, moved with fluid precision as he described partnerships with veterans organizations worldwide. "Turns out the language of service is universal," he said. "Whether you're struggling in Missouri or Mali, someone who's served understands." Marcus Blackwell, still running his bank but now focused on ethical lending practices, presented financial reports showing how the Foundation's model had revolutionized agricultural banking. "We lost billions by preventing foreclosures," he admitted, with a wry smile, "and made far more by creating stable, thriving rural economies. Turns out doing good can be very good business." Chad Beaumont stood to address the assembly. 15 years after mocking a veteran at auction, he now ran the world's largest program training financial professionals in compassionate foreclosure prevention. "I speak at business schools regularly," he said, "and tell them about the most expensive lesson I ever learned. Dignity is not a line item, but it determines the bottom line." The afternoon session featured testimony from communities transformed by the Foundation's work. A young Afghan veteran described how institute programs had helped him establish a regenerative farm in Vermont. An elderly Korean war veteran's son explained how mobile VA services had given his father dignity in his final years. Representative after representative demonstrated that Walter's vision had taken root far beyond his modest Missouri farm. During the break, Walter found himself surrounded by television crews. 12 years ago, he'd reluctantly accepted media attention. Now, at 95, he used it skillfully to advocate for rural causes. "The cameras come because of that helicopter day," he told a CNN reporter. "But they stay because the work matters. Every story we tell brings help to someone who needs it." The president, now serving his 2nd term, and crediting Walter's programs for helping win farm state support, delivered remarks via video link. "Walter Henshaw didn't just save his farm," the president declared. "He reminded us what America stands for. His institute proves that when we honor service, everyone benefits." Evening brought the traditional community dinner, where Foundation staff mingled with local residents in a celebration that felt more like family reunion than formal event. Walter noticed Lawrence Hamilton, the former bureaucrat who'd tried to audit them into oblivion, now serving as a volunteer coordinator. Like Beaumont, Hamilton had found redemption in service after his fall from power. Sarah found her father observing the gathering from a quiet corner. "Tired, Dad?" "Amazed," he corrected. "Still can't believe all this started because one arrogant auctioneer met his match in a president who remembered what matters." As the party wound down, an unfamiliar sound emerged from the evening sky. Not a helicopter this time, but a small plane performing aerobatic maneuvers above the gathering. The pilot completed a series of loops before landing smoothly in the designated field. The pilot who emerged wore civilian clothes but moved with military precision. "Sergeant Henshaw," he called, approaching Walter. "Captain Jessica Martinez, Air Force. Remember me?" Walter remembered. She'd been the young corporal who'd lost both legs in Afghanistan, saved by the mobile VA unit he'd advocated for, now successfully farming in Oregon. "I learned to fly," she explained, helping him stand. "Wanted to show you and say thanks one more time. Your programs gave me legs, but more importantly, they gave me purpose." She handed Walter a worn copy of a book. The Henshaw Effect. How One Farmer Changed Agriculture Forever. The author's name surprised him. Chad Beaumont. "Haven't read it yet," Walter admitted. "You should," Jessica said. "He gets some things right." The next morning brought news that the United Nations Agricultural Development Program had officially adopted the Henshaw model for global implementation. Representatives from 50 nations had signed agreements to create veteran-led agricultural support systems in their countries. "Your father's legacy circles the globe," Sarah told Walter as they reviewed congratulatory messages from world leaders. "Who'd have thought an auction in Havenbrook would lead to international policy?" Walter shrugged. "Ideas have consequences, especially good ones." Later that week, the Foundation held its final board meeting with Walter present as active chairman. His doctor had recommended he limit travel, but his mind remained sharp, his judgment sound. He'd already chosen Sarah as his successor, with Claire eventually taking over the international division. "Got a recommendation for my replacement," Walter announced, catching the board by surprise. They'd expected a long transition. "Chad Beaumont will serve as interim chairman while Sarah assumes permanent leadership." The room fell silent. Beaumont himself looked shocked. "Hear me out," Walter continued. "Chad understands what the Foundation means because he saw what it replaced. He knows the cost of forgetting dignity, the price of putting profit above people. That knowledge matters more than any business degree." Jake Morrison broke the tension with his characteristic bluntness. "Seconded. The man's earned it." The vote was unanimous. After the meeting, Beaumont approached Walter privately. "Why?" he asked simply. "Because redemption shouldn't end with forgiveness," Walter replied. "It should fuel purpose." The next phase of Walter's life brought quieter days, but no less impact. He mentored young veterans transitioning to civilian life, shared stories with school children, and maintained active correspondence with farmers and veterans worldwide who sought his counsel. His daily routine included morning coffee on the porch, reviewing Foundation news, and afternoon walks around the property with Sarah or Claire. The media still called, but less frequently. Politicians still sought his endorsement, but he gave it rarely. His power came from authenticity, not agenda. On a spring morning 3 years later, Walter's family gathered for his 98th birthday. The celebration drew smaller crowds now, more intimate. His closest advisers attended: Jake, Marcus, Beaumont, and surprisingly Hamilton, who'd served his time and returned to legitimate banking. "Never thought my auctioneer mistake would lead to this," Beaumont mused during the party. The Foundation under his chairmanship had expanded veteran services while maintaining Walter's core principles. "Mistakes become wisdom when properly learned," Walter observed. "You've done well." The evening ended with family on the porch, watching fireflies dance across fields that had witnessed extraordinary transformation. Walter's great-grandchildren listened as he recounted the helicopter day, a story that never grew old despite countless tellings. "Sometimes justice arrives exactly when needed," he concluded. carried by those who refused to let injustice prevail. As guests departed and family retired, Walter remained on the porch, savoring Missouri night air that had cradled his entire life. Sarah joined him with a blanket. "Ready for bed, Dad? In a minute." He gazed at stars that had watched generations of Henshaws work this land. Just thinking about that day 12 years ago, how one man's cruelty sparked something bigger than anyone imagined. "You made it bigger," Sarah said, "by refusing to accept it." "We all did," Walter corrected. "That's the real miracle. Not the helicopter, not the president, but people remembering they're stronger together." The conversation reminded him of his father's words decades ago. "Land doesn't belong to us. We belong to it, and through it to each other." The Henshaw Institute had simply expanded that belonging, connected those bonds across nations and oceans. As Sarah helped him inside, Walter paused at the threshold. Behind them, the Henshaw farm stretched into darkness. Before them, the warm glow of family and legacy beckoned. Between these spaces lay all the lives they'd touched, all the communities preserved, all the dignity restored. "Think we did all right?" he asked Sarah. "Think you did exactly what you were meant to do?" Walter nodded, satisfied. Purpose fulfilled wasn't about grand monuments or lasting fame. It was about leaving things better than you found them, about standing up when standing was difficult, about transforming personal salvation into collective liberation. The screen door closed behind them, but the light burned late into the Missouri night. Tomorrow would bring new challenges for those who carried his work forward. But tonight, in the quiet satisfaction of battles won and purposes served, Walter Henshaw rested in the peace earned by those who've done what needed doing. Outside, the wind whispered through corn that grew on land, saved not just for one family, but for the idea that service never truly ends, sacrifice never grows old, and sometimes, just sometimes, justice arrives precisely when hope seems lost. The helicopter sounds had long faded, but their echo remained in every life touched, every farm preserved, every community reminded that in America, ordinary people still possess extraordinary power to create change, one courageous act at a time. And in Havenbrook, Missouri, where it all began, the cycles continued, planting and harvest, challenge and triumph, service and sacrifice, generation after generation, learning that when you stand for what's right, the whole world sometimes stops to notice. Walter slept peacefully that night, knowing his watch had been kept well, his battle fought honorably, his legacy secured not in stone or bronze, but in living communities of those who remembered that dignity matters, service transforms, and sometimes salvation arrives on wings of steel to those who refuse to surrender hope. The Henshaw story continued, not because of helicopters or presidents, but because some truths, once recognized, become eternal. The Henshaw story continued, not because of helicopters or presidents, but because some truths, once recognized, become eternal. 20 years later, Walter passed peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by 7 generations of family photos and letters from countless lives he'd touched. His funeral drew dignitaries and world leaders, but the true mourners were farmers and veterans whose dignity he'd restored. A grove of oak trees was planted in his memory, one sapling for every family farm the Institute had saved. Today, children still gather to hear about the day justice descended from the sky, when a Marine's quiet faith in America was rewarded. By America remembering its heroes, The helicopter footage, viewed by millions, remains a testament to what happens when we honor those who sacrifice without seeking glory, who give without demanding recognition, who stand up for what's right, even when everything seems lost, because sometimes, just sometimes, being right matters more than being powerful. And on that remarkable morning in Havenbrook, one elderly farmer proved that truth still has the power to move mountains, or at least to bring presidents to their knees. If this story touched your heart, share where you're watching from in the comments. And if you believe some legacies deserve to endure forever, subscribe to our channel. Tomorrow brings another tale of courage and justice. Don't miss it.